10. You're not coming. I am too coming. And if I don't, the whole ship is going to get a shot of your naked ass on their screens in the morning, Box said, his tinny voice coming through the comm. Do it, and you won't live to regret it, Cass replied, double-checking to make sure he had all his equipment. Drastic times call for drastic measures, Box yelled. Oh, yeah? Let me talk to Zax. That's not necessary, Box replied too quickly. Uh-huh. Cass turned and motioned for Ryan to load the rest of the cargo containers on the shuttle. It had been Cass's idea to take a sampling of food with them to show good faith, though he wouldn't be using it unless necessary. The fact is, you have a responsibility here now, and you can't go off globetrotting with me whenever you feel like it. Zax may need you for the procedure later. There was an inaudible grumbling on the other side of the comm. What was that? Have a good time, Box said, his voice forced and low. He cut the channel. Cass chuckled and turned back to the shuttle. He'd be done sulking by the time they got back. Jan was already aboard, running through the pre-flight sequence. Breach had said the hub was a day's journey away, which meant they'd need one of the larger shuttles, complete with full crew quarters and cargo bay. They'd already packed all the supplies they needed, plus some extra, and what Cass hoped to barter. Even though they were on one of the largest shuttles Tempest carried, he felt it might get a little cramped. Not only were Jan and Ryan providing their much-needed muscle, but also Uma was coming along to guard Reej, who would need to be kept on a short leash until they got there. Speaking of which, Cass glanced toward the bay's entrance, looking for Uma. She hadn't reported in with a prisoner yet. Have you heard from the lieutenant? Cass asked Ryan and Jan. Nope, Jan replied from the front, even though Cass couldn't see her since she was 2 sections up. Sorry, man, nothing yet, Ryan replied, setting down the last of their bartering crates in the shuttle's hold. I need to go check. As Cass spoke, he turned to see Reej being led through the main connector into the bay by Lieutenant Yamashita. He trotted over to her. Where's Uma? I volunteered to go instead, she replied. Oh, and the captain was fine with it? She was. Okay, then. Cass wasn't about to argue with the young woman. He motioned for her to follow him over to the shuttle, dragging Reej along on a set of cuffs that had been pulled taut. He suspected there was something going on between Evie and Laura, but he wasn't about to butt in. Guess it will be like old times, he replied. Just as long as you're not flying. He chuckled. No, Captain Jan will be taking care of that today. She and Ryan will be our backup when we get to the hub. No backup. It's safe, Reej replied from behind. Cass leaned around her. We don't go into unknown situations without backup. How stupid do you think we are? Guards will give Tiamat the wrong impression. Cass glanced at Laura. Well, then we'll just have to be discreet. And if it turns out to be a trap, you're going to wish you'd never borrowed from this ship. Understand me? Reej slapped his chest twice. I'll take that as a yes. Get him aboard and settled. He's on the bottom bunk. Well, what's bunk? Reej asked. Where you'll be sleeping. You do sleep. Yes. Lying down? Yes. Then you'll be fine. Laura led him up the ramp in the back around all the crates Ryan had stacked inside, and maneuvered him into the small crew quarters that were partitioned off between the cargo area and the shuttle's command deck. Anything else? Cass asked, as Ryan finished securing all the containers to the walls. I think that's it, though I really wish we could take our space wings. Me too. I'd feel better with the extra firepower. Speaking of which, he patted under his armpit. Already got it. Ryan slapped Cass's boom cannon in his hands. It was his custom-designed weapon, and had been in storage ever since Cass had come on board. He'd missed his old companion. He shoved the weapon into its holster under his jacket, just like old times. When we get back, I want you to show me how you designed that thing, Ryan said. Could be useful if we could get a couple more of those. The boom cannon was unique, because it fired not only plasma bursts, as most traditional weapons did, but also projectile rounds as well. You could set it to fire both at once, or in a pattern, depending on the type of enemy you were facing. Cass had rarely used it, But when he did, he always found it more than effective. "We've got a day of travel and not much to do with it. I'll show you as soon as we take off." "Deal," Ryant replied. "Guess that's it then. Everybody good to launch?" A round of different affirmations came back to them. Ryant wiped his hands and tapped the button beside the cargo door. At first, it illuminated with a blue glow, and then the door slid down, locking them inside. Cass couldn't help his heart rate from jumping, but he pressed the sensation down, ignoring it as best he could. The blue glow disappeared. "All sealed, Commander." "I told you don't have to call me that." "Yeah, I know. But once Raffenkel started doing it, we all did. Just makes things easier." Cass shook his head. "I'll be up there in a minute." Ryant nodded and took his leave, passing through the cargo doors. Cass took a deep breath and tried not to think about how long he'd have to be on the shuttle. Thankfully, it wasn't the same size or model as the one Susanna had been on. But still, it was a shuttle. And even though it had gotten easier, he still wasn't over his phobia. He wasn't sure it would ever completely go away. He tapped his personal comm. "Captain?" "Diazal here." "We're ready to go. Everything set on your end?"
"We're good up here. Best of luck."
He wanted to ask if everything was all right with her and Laura, but he promised himself he wouldn't interfere, and so he kept his mouth shut. "Thanks. See you in a few days." He ended the comm and made his way to the front, passing where Laura had locked Reach down to his particular bunk. His arms hung down from the bar on above the ceiling, but otherwise he looked comfortable enough lying down.
"Not a trap," he said as Cass passed him. I'd never do that."
"See, there's the problem," Cass replied, stopping. "I don't know if you do that or not, because I don't know you. And until I do, this is how we're going to do things, because I don't like getting jerked around. Cool?"
No, I'm quite warm."
Laura stepped back inside the crew quarters, keeping near the door, observing. Cass noticed her, but said nothing. Instead, kept his attention on Breach. "I need to know what kind of man this Diamant is before we meet him. What should I expect?" Breach sucked in a breath of air.
He's our prophet. He survived. Gives Bulak safe harbor. I've traveled all over. No one else helps us. All afraid of us. Afraid ghosts will come for them if they help us."
"Ghosts?"
Those that destroyed Lack. They disappeared. Ghosts. Other species think we are marked for death. That the Great Ones didn't protect us."
He shuddered, but Cass couldn't tell if it was involuntary or not.
"But Diamant survived. The Great Ones kept him alive to lead us."
Cass took a seat opposite Reach on one of the other bunks. "So he's generous, willing to help those in need." Reach hesitated too long for Cass's liking.
"Yes. Helps. Bulak are scattered all over. Probably maybe less than 50,000 of us left. Many factions, many tribes." "So you're saying he may not have control over the ships attacking Tempest?" Laura said.
Reach turned to her.
"Right. My people are getting desperate. Diamant controls the hub. What few resources are concentrated there."
Cass rubbed his forehead in frustration. Feuding factions and people desperate for a solution to their problems. No wonder they've been attacking Tempest. What does he want, above all else? Reach cocked his head, as if he hadn't understood the question.
To save the Bulak. To preserve what is left."
Cass shifted on the bunk. "And what is your relationship with him?"
I...
Reach hesitated again.
"I know him. Worked together in the past."
"Doing what?"
"Borrowing."
Cass dropped his gaze. "That's why you were on our ship. He sent you there." He'd been right. This whole thing was nothing but a trap. He stood, turning his attention to Laura. "Tell Jan to turn us around. This is nothing but a trap.
No, Reed said, agitated. Not a trap. Genuine. I wasn't working for him when I found your jewel. I'm my own. Have been for a long time.
Why? Cass asked. Why leave the security of this hub if it's so great? And why break off a relationship with Diamant if he only wants to help people? Breach turned away, staring at the far side of the wall. Cass nodded to Laura. Tell Jan, and comp Tempest if we're still in range of the short-range transmitters. We'll have to figure some...
Because I am different,
Breach shouted, sitting up. Cass stepped back, his hand immediately going to his boom cannon. He watched Reach for a moment, the back of his jacket expanding like there was a balloon there, until what he could only identify as two sharp mechanical arms ripped through the fabric, wrapping themselves around Reach. What the hell? One arm reached out, and on the end, Cass could see it split into two dangerously sharp blades, opening and snapping closed like a crab's claws. One of the claws reached up to where the cuffs had been affixed to the bar above him and snapped the air beside them, but then retracted again, folding back through the tears in Reach's jacket and disappearing from view. Did you know about those? Cass asked Laura, his hand still on his weapon.
They weren't in the log.
Do you mean to tell me you could have broken out of those restraints at any time? Cass asked. Breach pulled up and slapped his chest twice with his forearms. Cass took that as his culture's gesture of a yes. Then why didn't you?
Prisoners aren't supposed to escape, he said.
What are those things?
Breach concentrated. My people are born with their own mandibles. They grow from our backs and help us complete tasks or are for defense. I lost mine when I was young.
What does that have to do with Diamant? Laura demanded.
When Diamant found out, banishment.
Breach turned away again in what Cass easily recognized as shame. But you got them replaced. Aren't yours as good as anyone else's? Cass asked.
No. Mandibles are a part of a Bulak's nature. To lose them is a great dishonor.
Cass released the butt of his gun. He was pretty sure if Reed had wanted, he could have killed every one of the Space Wing pilots that brought him aboard, as well as anyone else within a 1-meter radius during any time of his incarceration. He also could have removed his restraints at any time, or kept the mandibles secret. But instead, he just laid there, staring at the ceiling of his bunk, and chained up, when he didn't have to be. Laura leaned over.
So, if they're not in good terms, how was he supposed to get us to see Diamant? She whispered.
11.
Sir, wake up.
Cass was jostled from a dreamless sleep back into the reality of the shuttle's crew quarters. It took him a moment to gather his bearings, and for a second he thought he was back on the reasonable excuse. He glanced over to see Laura standing beside the high bunk, her head barely visible over the top where he lay. He drew a deep breath. You don't have to call me sir.
Fine, she replied. I think we're almost there. Jan told me to come get you.
She turned and left the crew bunks. Cass oriented himself and dropped his legs over the edge and hunched out of the cramped bed. The bunks were really horizontal alcoves that could be shut if the occupant wanted, but they didn't leave a lot of room for comfort. They weren't much more than a meter in height in order to maximize the number of spaces in one shuttle, which made getting in and out of them a challenge, especially the top ones. Cass hopped down and bent to check on Reed on the bottom bunk, still in the same position he'd left him in. He didn't expect the alien to go anywhere, or to even break his restraints. If Reed was planning something, he wouldn't act until they had disembarked. Though Cass couldn't help but think he still hadn't gotten over his shame from admitting to them his disability, if you could call it that. If Cass had 2-meter-long bladed scythes tucked into the folds of his back, he certainly wouldn't consider them a disadvantage. He made his way to the front of the shuttle, where Jan and Laura sat in the pilot and co-pilot seats respectively. Without turning to acknowledge him, Jan nodded toward the structure ahead of them.
That's it.
right where he said it would be. Seems kinda plain. It looked like nothing other than a massive rectangle floating in space. Though the outside had markings and other indications, it was more like a massive cargo container. I don't see any ports or any access areas. How are we supposed to get in? It's like Takar, Jan said. What's Takar? Training mission, she replied. A couple years back, we had a training exercise in the Argotha system. Takar is the asteroid belt which makes up most of the system. It's huge. But our training involved dogfighting in an area with a lot of obstacles. Dorsey, Griffin, and I, we'd hidden out behind one of the larger rocks, waiting for the autoprobes to come find us, when Griffin gets this insane idea we needed a window. A window? Cass asked. Yeah. So she starts blasting away at the rock, burrowing a tunnel straight through it with the weapons. Ryan and I joined in, and a few minutes later we had a 2-meter square tunnel we could stare down the barrel. As the autoprobes approached, Griffin shot straight through that tunnel, taking them out easy. Cass screwed up his face. You want to blow a hole in the side to get through? Is that what I'm hearing? Maybe we should just ask the resident alien. I'm sure he knows, Laura said. Cass nodded and returned to the crew compartment. Vreej looked up when he entered, and Cass reached over, unlocking his restraints from the bar holding them to the ceiling. We're here, he said. I figure you could have done that at any time, and you didn't, so I want to thank you for that. But no sudden movements. Vreej touched his palms to his chest, tapping twice, and moved to stand up. When he was up, Cass could clearly see the holes in the back of his jacket where the mandibles had punched through. Were you ever going to tell us about those? He asked. No. I thought I might need them to escape, he replied. I didn't expect trust. You mean you didn't expect us to take you up on your offer to come here, Cass replied. Breach touched his forehead with 2 fingers. I don't know what that means. I didn't expect it. Cass surveyed the small room. Neither did I. But both our people need help, and maybe we can help each other. Head up to the front. I think we're here. Breach made his way past Cass, careful not to touch him, and Cass followed, trying to see the outline of the folded mandibles on his back. But the jacket hid them well. Raffinkel was going to have a fit when she found out he'd been harboring dangerous weapons, and her people hadn't searched him. Is this it? Laura asked, as Reed stared out the main window of the shuttle. He tapped his chest twice. What is that? Does he mean yes? Yes, Reed said, his gaze locked on the rectangle. This is all that is left of your people? Cass asked. This is where most of us are, he replied. Others still scattered. He pointed to the large rectangle. We used our largest cargo holds, stitched them together, built what we could. Your people. You excel at engineering, don't you? Cass asked. Breach tapped his chest twice again. Pulling those power converters off the side of Tempest was delicate work. I'm not even sure we could have done it from that side, and certainly not as fast. Experience, Breach replied. It's something I can appreciate. How do we dock? I don't see any ports. You don't dock? No ports. Land. Did he say land? Jan asked. Breach pointed to the port side of the rectangle. Over there. Bring us around. See what he's talking about. Jan swung the shuttle around to the side where Breach had pointed, and his reason became clear. This side of the rectangle was open to the inside, which was nothing short of breathtaking. The Bulak may have repurposed old shipping containers, but the inside was a fully functioning city. Cass could tell where other smaller ships had been repurposed and retooled into buildings that now peppered the floor of the cargo containers. Some were stacked on top of each other, and some had been disassembled and re-engineered to create brand new structures. The far side of the container was closed, and scaffolding climbed all over that end of the structure, while the entire ground of the massive container was covered, with the exception of maybe a dozen different landing sites. The walls had been reinforced with skeleton structures, and some of the buildings had begun to climb up the sides, acting as additional supports. Cass also noticed large pipes running through the streets between the buildings, from one end of the structure to the other. He took note of the high number of spired buildings inside. Could those be shrines of some kind? Breach? This is the hub? He asked.
Yes.
And how long did it take your people to create this? He seemed to be doing a calculation in his head.
94 Vreed stays.
Cass furrowed his brow. Vreed stays? I think he means the length of his stay on Tempest, Jan offered. Vreed tapped his chest twice. But you've only been on the ship 2 days. You mean to tell me your people did all this in 180 days? Cass gawked at the structure. Had he not known better, he would have said it had been there for centuries, not barely more than 2 seasons. What had their home planet been like? You really do have an abundance of building materials.
The best,
Reach replied. Jan, patch into the autovox and send them a message requesting to land. Cass understood why they needed food and medicine now. They could literally build whatever they wanted, but without a constant supply of food, their people would all die out, great structures or not. The destruction of lack had probably destroyed what food-producing facilities they had. This is the shuttle Hymettus, requesting permission to land on the Bulak structure, hub, Jan said into the system. The comm was silent for a moment as they waited on the response.
Sometimes it takes a minute,
Reed said, tapping the small device on his neck. Approved. Please follow the appended coordinates. A voice very unlike Regis said on the other end. Cass was surprised, but tried not to show it. He thought Regis' stutter might be a natural affliction of the autovox not being able to properly translate his words. But that might not be the case after all. Jan brought the shuttle down, and as they passed the terminus into the city, there was a slight bit of turbulence.
Pressurization,
Reed said when Cass glanced at him. Are we... Holy shit, Ryan said, emerging from the back. This place is huge. The way he was talking, I thought it was just going to be a bunch of ships tethered together floating out in space. This thing is probably as big as Starbase 8, if not bigger. They're builders, Cass replied. He noticed as they were setting down on one of the pads a number of smaller ships coming and going through the space. Many were headed off toward the back of the container. Breach? What are those?
Supplies to build the temple.
Is that what all the scaffolding at the back of the structure is for? It seemed like whatever this temple was, it would be massive when it was finished.
Yes, it would have been already finished, but slow since
you're having trouble feeding your people, Cass finished. Breach tapped his chest twice. Contact, Jan said, as the shuttle set down to the pad. Keep it hot or shut down? She turned to Cass. Keep it hot. We don't know what we're walking into here. In fact, I think you should stay with the ship just in case. Jan eyed him. You're sure? I came along to be your backup. I know. Just keep an eye out, and let us know if there's anything funny going on while we're meeting this Diamant. We do have valuable supplies on board, after all. She nodded and drew a pistol from a hiding spot Cass hadn't even seen, placing it on the console where she could reach it quick. Cass turned to Ryan and Laura. You two, equip force barriers and light weapons. I don't want to go in guns blazing, but I also don't want to get jumped. Use your best discretion.
You don't need weapons,
Breach said after them. Look, if all your people have these mandibles on their backs, which can kill us in an instant, we're not going in there without some protection. I don't care how peaceful your people are. Not to mention, every encounter we've had with them so far has been hostile.
Outliers,
Breach replied.
Not like the rest.
We'll see. 10 minutes later, the four exited the shuttle, leaving Jan inside by herself. Cass gave her a reassuring wave as they approached the 2 Bulaks standing on the edge of the landing pad, their hands crossed in front of them. One of them spoke to Reed as they approached, and he spoke back, though Cass couldn't understand either of them. He didn't like being in the dark, especially in a situation like this.
They want to know our purpose here, Reed said.
Tell them trade, and to see Diamant, Cass replied. Before stepping off the Hymettus, he'd taken stock of himself. He hadn't been out of the Coalition in seasons, the last time being when he was on Zenfor's ship. But before that, the last place had been Devil's Gate. And this place felt more like there than anywhere else he'd been lately. It was dirty, crowded, noisy, and Cass got the distinct impression everyone was out for themselves here.
He won't want to see you,
one of the Bulaks said in perfect standard, after Reed had relayed the message. Cass caught sight of small translators on their necks as well. Either they had synced up with Regis, or the few words he spoke had been enough for them to translate. Cass stepped forward. We are here to make a deal. We were told he needed assistance. The Bulak stared at Reed before turning his attention back to Cass. What kind of deal? That's for us and him to work out. Cass's eyes widened as from behind the Bulak, two large mandibles extended, their ends snapping and clicking. They were grayish-green in tint, much different from Reed's mechanical ones. And by core, they looked sharp. Cass instinctively reached for his gun. We didn't come here to hurt anyone. We may have supplies you need. But if Diamant doesn't want to talk, we'll be on our way. He made a motion for Laura and Ryan to step back, which they did, while all three kept their eyes on the guards. The mandible retracted behind the man, and he glanced at his counterpart. They both tapped their chests twice. Follow me, he replied. 12. As the guards led them through the narrow streets between what were once shuttles, repair craft, pleasure vessels, and several other kinds of ships Cass didn't recognize, he felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. Many of the buildings they passed had no windows or doors, and the ones he could see into were filthy inside. Cass could only assume this was residue from all the construction, though cleaning was probably on the bottom of your priority list if you were just trying to eat and feed your family. Small Bulak children without shirts skirted around their feet, playing games, and oblivious to the dire nature of their world. Though Cass did get a good look at how their mandibles folded up on their backs. They were like another set of thin, compound arms, which scissored in and locked behind the Bulak shoulder blades. They blended in so well, they were almost invisible, unless you looked hard. Cass could only imagine had it been a contributing factor as to why the Bulak evolved as the dominant species of their planet. Almost every corner they turned, they were confronted with another unique smell. While most were tinged with sulfur, a few he didn't recognize and were completely foreign to his palate. He was glad he'd ordered everyone to wear the force barriers. There was no telling what kind of diseases these people might be unintentionally carrying. He glanced over at Ryant. You ever heard of Grum? Ryant furrowed his brow. Border world? On the far side of Sargan space, past Tau Hydri? That's it. I went there once on a courier job. I was one of the last non-Grum ships to leave the planet. The Sargans had cut them off, forced them to become self-sufficient. This place reminds me of what little I saw. Cut off from the trade routes and influx of goods and exports off the planet, the people were starving. Why were you there? To pick up some last-minute diplomats from Cassiopeia, Cass said, stepping over a man slumped down to the wall, his head hung between his knees. They were delivering the final edicts to the Grum. 100 years of banishment. Then, if anyone was still alive after a century, they'd be admitted back into the Sargan way of life with a clean slate. Seems kind of harsh, Ryan said. It was designed to act as a message. The Grum had rejected the Sargan edicts, and in a move of sheer lunacy had tried to emulate the Coalition. I heard about it from one of my courier buddies. The Sargans weren't pleased. So they cut them off entirely? Cass nodded. To show everyone else in the Commonwealth what would happen if they didn't maintain loyalty. I can tell you, not many people in the Commonwealth are what we would call happy. But they sure won't be rejecting the edicts anytime soon. Sounds like a shitty place, Ryan replied, tenderness in his voice. I'm surprised you could stay there. It wasn't like I had a lot of choices. And it has its positives. But yeah, the Grum didn't deserve that. Just like I suspect most of these people don't deserve this. Can you imagine having your entire system destroyed? Think about what that would do to the Coalition. He screwed up his face. Earth and Claxia Prime would be gone immediately. Valis, too. The defense grid. Outpost Alpha, Beta, maybe even Gamma. That's a lot right there. Cass nodded. Enough to cripple us. This could very well be us if those aliens reach home. We have to do everything we can to stop that from happening. How long ago were you on Grum? Ryant asked. 3 years. And what's it like now? Last I heard, they'd lost 60% of the population to starvation. God damn. Ryant looked like he might be sick. Maybe Cass shouldn't have relayed that story so close to meeting Diamant. That probably could have kept until they were back on the shuttle. The guards continued to lead them through winding alleys and roads. One thing Cass noticed was there didn't seem to be a defined thoroughfare anywhere. The roads seemed to follow the shapes of whatever ships were being used as buildings, with little thought to spatial planning. The only way he could keep his bearings was by keeping an eye on the large pipes that crisscrossed above them in different directions. As best he could tell, they were moving further toward the back of the structure, but it barely reached a quarter of the way so far. Now he really had wished Box had come. He could have built a mental map of this place in an instant. Cass wasn't feeling too good about their ability to escape this maze back to the ship unscathed. Finally, the smaller ships opened up to a much larger structure. Cass could tell it had once been a medium-sized ship of some kind, but so much of it had been dismantled and repurposed, it was hard to see exactly what its purpose had been. It was as if the Bulak had taken this particular ship and turned it into one of their shrines. A large dome sat on the top, capped by a spire reaching high into the space. In front of the ship, a grand staircase had been constructed, leading up to the access port, as the landing gear of the ship itself was still deployed. How could these people spend so much time building and expending energy when they had little to no food available? And how many had they lost in the process? Cass wasn't sure he wanted to know. They reached the top of the staircase, with Reach in front, Laura right behind him, with her hand on her weapon, and Cass and Ryant bringing up the rear. Cass could sense the tension among them, much of it emanating from Laura. Evie had told him she'd been in the tactical simulator a lot lately, though he suspected that was more for the tactical station itself rather than hand-to-hand combat. He hoped he didn't have to find out how much training she'd been through. The guards led them to the narrow corridors of the ship's shrine until they reached what had to be the rear, where it opened inside. In what was probably once the engine room, the entire area had been repurposed into what looked to Cass to be a refugee camp. Beds of all sizes littered the floor and swung from apparatus bolted into the walls, while Bulak of all shapes and sizes milled about. It had become a place of refuge for these people. Cass noticed other Bulak moving through the crowd, handing out supplies and rations, taking special care to make sure each Bulak child had something. "It's a sanctuary," Ryant whispered, as they all looked on. One of the Bulak guards who'd escorted them made an unusual noise in his throat that sounded to Cass like a cough, combined with a click. Half of the people down below glanced up, but one in particular stood out. He was larger, more muscular than the others, and Cass could tell he'd been fed better, despite the fact he was one of those handing out rations. His face was similar to Vreege's, though a few scars ran across his cheeks and over his bald head. Cass had no doubt he was the man they were here to see. He handed the rations he was holding off to another helper and made his way up a side staircase to them, motioning they follow him through another set of corridors. The guards indicated it was okay, but Vreege held back as Cass took the lead, wanting to make the first impression. He couldn't help but wonder just how dire these people's situation was. As they walked, he tapped the comm embedded in the back of his hand. "Hey, Saturn. Everything good?" "Still good here," Jan replied. "They haven't even come close to me yet." "Good. Keep me informed." "You got it." He cut the transmission. After a few more minutes, the corridors opened into another large space, though not as large as the one they just left. Cass recognized it as the control center for what had been the ship, though many of the components had been cannibalized or removed. The only indicator this had been the bridge was one large chair in the middle of the room, where the man they'd followed now stood. Each of the guards touched the small black devices on their necks as he picked one up from the chair, affixing it in the same place. Cass glanced to the others. Ryan seemed alert, but relaxed. Laura's eyes were darting around the space, as if looking for a way out in case there was trouble, while Reed remained completely immobile, his focus on the floor in front of the other Bulak's feet. Feet, Cass noticed, adorned by quality boots, much better than Reed's scraped and tattered versions. The man they'd followed in here tapped his chest twice, and the two guards approached Cass and the others. No sudden movements. They each held up a small device and moved it up and down in front of each of them. They're armed, one of the guards said. Leave them be, the man said, his voice strong, yet slightly raspy. They didn't come here to kill us. The guards exchanged glances, then dropped their devices and took up positions behind the group. Or am I wrong? What is your purpose here? Cass stepped forward. My name is Caspian Rabot. I come from what is known as a sovereign coalition of aligned systems, a confederacy far from here. We were told you needed help. You were. The man's eyes darted to Vreej and remained fixed on him. Vreej seemed to shrink under the gaze. I must admit we are the recipients of some very bad luck, but we are not as destitute as some might have made it seem. Are you Diamant? Cass asked. I am. But I'm sorry if you were led to believe I'm some kind of influence here. I am merely a humble servant of the Bulak people. Vreej made a noise, and Diamant shot him a look, causing the smaller Bulak to shrink away. Cass glanced back to the guards, then took in what had once been an opulent bridge. Doesn't look that way from where I'm standing. Diamant cocked his head, much in the same way Vreej had done when he didn't understand something. Caspian, I was given the gift of a second chance. I can't waste that on anything other than service to my people. They may hold me in some high regard, but I assure you, I'm little more than a man of my people. Cass sensed Laura shift uncomfortably beside him. Will you at least allow us to make an offer? He asked. Diamant tapped his chest twice. Thank you. My ship needs building and repair materials, which I can see you have an abundance of. We have food, medicine, and other supplies to trade. We can help each other. A crease formed across Diamant's considerable brow. He took a few steps to the right, his head bowed in contemplation. Caspian, would you consider yourself a trusting person? Do you find you're generally a good judge of character? The question put Cass off. He wasn't sure what the man was getting at, but he felt like they were being toyed with, and he didn't appreciate it. Those are two different questions, and I don't really think my answer would make any difference to you. Diamant made a sound which Cass assumed was a laugh, from the amused look on his face. I can't fault you for that. But I must ask, why have you taken the word of a known outcast, someone who is a disgrace to our people and our heritage? Cass looked at Reed. Look, I'm not concerned with your internal politics. Reed told us of your history. We thought it was worth the risk. You must be in quite the need if you're willing to trust the word of a criminal. How did you know he wasn't leading you into a trap? Cass felt like he was being teased, as if this was an elaborate dance, and he didn't like where it was going. He assisted in the defense of our ship, and I don't need to justify my decisions to you. All I need to do is negotiate a trade, then we'll be on our way. Diamant's gaze landed on Cass. You are straightforward. I can appreciate that in a man. But I have one more question for you. Why would you trust a man whose people are so desperate they would do anything to survive? Why would such a man not do whatever is necessary to accomplish his own goals? Cass turned to Reach again, who had seemed to shrink down even further. Sometimes risks are necessary. We don't have the luxury of playing it safe. He turned back to Diamant. And neither do you, at least from what I've seen. Diamant puffed air through his nose, though Cass couldn't tell if he was amused or annoyed. Very well. Let us make a circle, and we can discuss your offer. 13. Evie strode down the corridor, her heart beating 100 beats per second. She'd been in the middle of helping Zal reset some of the control units on Deck 6 before they lost all power for half the ship, when Zax had called. The urgency of her voice had done little to assuage Evie's fears, and the hypervator had taken forever to get up to 6. But now that she was only a few meters from sickbay, she wished it had taken longer. She wasn't sure she was ready to hear what the doctor had to say. The doors moved aside for her, and the first person she saw was Box. He glanced up when she entered, but when he didn't make some kind of crack, she knew something was wrong. She glanced over to Zax, who had stood from her desk in the adjoining section, and made her way out to Evie. "Before you say anything," Evie said, "just give me a minute to breathe, okay?" "I could provide an anti-anxiety drop," Box offered from the other side of the room. "That won't be necessary," Zax replied. "The captain can handle it. Let's go in my office." Evie didn't want to go in the office. Plus, all the other patients had been discharged. It was only her, Box, the doctor, and a few nurses milling about. Everyone in this room already knew, except for her. So why the need for propriety? "No. Just tell me here." "Captain, I really think you should—" "Stop calling me Captain," Evie hissed. "I'm not the captain. Green is. And until—" But she didn't need to say another word when she saw Zax's face. Even though she had 6 eyes, they were all filled with sadness and pity, and Evie hated it when people looked at her like that. "No." "Box and I began the procedure a few hours ago," Zax said, her voice hushed. She reached out with 2 of her hands and placed them on Evie's arms. "The new technique I developed showed the damage was far worse than we'd originally thought." Evie winced, tears welling up in her eyes. "No." "Here, come on," Zax said, leading her into her office. She helped Evie take a seat while she pulled something up on her display. She flipped the image so it was visible from the other side. "This is Captain Green's normal brain scan. We take them every 3 seasons. His was made not more than 60 days ago." Tears were already running down Evie's face, despite her furiously wiping them away. The image was blurry, and she couldn't seem to clear her eyes to get a good look. "This is a scan I took this morning, using the deep tissue micros. See all this here?" She pointed to an area around the middle where the 2 halves of the brain connected. It was a deep red in the middle, surrounded by an orange aura. "Is all that from the attack?" Evie asked, trying to retain her professionalism. "No, but the attack was the catalyst. His brain has a genetic anomaly we hadn't previously detected, and when he was injured, it only exacerbated an existing condition the captain has been living with his entire life. I'm afraid he's down to 2% brain function. He won't wake up from the induced coma." "Won't or can't?" Evie asked. "Either. If we use our equipment to bring him out of the coma, he'd have no bodily control. He wouldn't even be able to breathe on his own. The brain is a husk at this point, and it's only getting worse. This disease will tear it apart, piece by piece. Once this specific anomaly is active, it's like a parasite that feeds on brain matter." Evie put her head in her hands for a moment, then withdrew them, wiping the tears at the same time. She took a deep breath. "What do we need to do?" Zax folded her top set of hands in front of her. "I suggest cutting all life support. I don't believe any of him is in any way conscious. Though if he is, it isn't pleasant. My hope is he's already gone,
And while I can still detect some very light brain activity, that could just be the anomaly at work, lighting up its brain centers as it consumes.
You want to kill him, she replied. You want to kill one of the most decorated captains in the fleet.
Evelyn,
Zack said.
He's dead already. There's nothing we can do but end his suffering.
But that can't be possible, she hissed. He needs to take command of the ship, of this crew. He has to get us out of this. She could feel the desperation clawing at the edges of her mind, but she didn't care. What good was all this technology if it couldn't save the captain's life? Why did they even have a sick bay if some random anomaly could kill any of them at a moment's notice?
I know you don't want to hear this, but that's your job now. This clearly falls under the Coalition's Battlefield Promotion Statute. You need to formally take command of this ship, because there is no one else who can do the job.
She pulled her tight ponytail over her shoulder, feeling the familiar wrap in her hand. Wiping her eyes one last time to make sure she'd cleared any remnants of tears, she stood.
Do you need my authorization?
Zax nodded.
As the chief medical officer of this ship, I can elect to do it alone. But I prefer your signature on the documents as well.
She drew in a deep breath through her nose.
I need some time to make sure everything is in order. I understand, but please don't take too long. If there's even a chance he's conscious, he could be in agony.
Evie nodded, pulling her lips between her teeth. She squinted at Zax.
Anything else? Not right now.
She left the doctor there, passing Box without a word, and launching herself into the corridor. As soon as the doors were closed behind her, she slammed the base of her fist into the wall. God damn it! Heaving breaths almost overtook her, but she wasn't going to pass out, and she wasn't going to let this get her. But she wasn't ready to lead this ship. She wasn't ready to do this all alone, especially not after everything she'd been experiencing lately. How was the crew supposed to count on someone who was seeing hallucinations and couldn't tell the real from the imagined? How was she even fit to command in that sort of state? Sure, things had stabilized, but there was no guarantee they'd stay that way. And she wasn't sure she could risk the safety of the crew. It should have been her. If she hadn't been out on that shuttle, she never would have seen that stupid arch and would have been on the bridge when the mines hit. She could have saved him, but instead, she'd been in engineering going through mental therapy with Sester. She couldn't think like that. It would only make things worse. She really wished Laura hadn't gone off on the mission. When she'd come to her and asked, Evie hadn't been sure if it was because she wanted to prove herself or if she was just upset about what had happened the other night. She hoped it wasn't the latter, because until then, things had been pretty good. And if something little like that could get between them, how were they supposed to navigate the really rough stuff? How was she supposed to do this by herself, without his guidance and wisdom? Was it even possible? Evie pulled her hand away from the wall, noticing a dent where she'd hit it. She furrowed her brow. Normally, these bulkheads were reinforced galvanium. Maybe one of the maintenance teams had replaced some of these with less sturdy materials. Right now, she really didn't care. She had a lot of paperwork to do. Officially transferring command to the ship required a lot of prep work, and she better get it done before the next attack came. The last thing she needed was to issue an order to the computer, only for it to refuse or spit back an error because she'd forgotten to change the command controls. Sighing, Evie left the corridor and headed back for the bridge. 14. When Diamant said they'd make a circle, Cass thought he was being cagey, or perhaps the autobox malfunctioned. But no, he had meant a circle. He'd gathered them all around a central point of the room and had them crouch down, though he'd stared daggers at Vreege, who had excused himself back to the other side of the room with the guards. In the middle of the circle, Diamant had placed a small disc about a half a meter in diameter on the ground. It was thin, seemed to have some heft to it, and the top was covered in a shimmering material. Cass couldn't help but consider the absurdity of the situation. The four of them crouching on all sides of the circle in this decrepit old room that had once been the command center for a large and powerful Bulak ship. He also realized he wouldn't be able to hold this position very long, as he'd yet again neglected Box's advice and skipped all of his gym times. But with everything that had been happening the past few weeks, he doubted anyone had time to get down there. But his legs were going to get sore, fast. He suspected that wasn't the case for Diamant, or any of the other Bulak. With their powerful hindquarters, Cass bet they could probably spring 10 meters in the air if they really wanted to. Diamant glanced at each of them in turn, then tapped the top of the disc. It glowed bright blue, which then transformed into blue plasma. It wasn't hot, but it lit up the room in a way the natural lighting couldn't. The walls seemed to react to the flame, glowing with energy themselves. "Wow," Laura whispered. "This is what is known as a seating circle," Diamant said. "It is where my people come together to speak of our days, to work out our problems, and to pray. I have invited you into my seating circle so we may discuss your offer." Remembering Laska's lessons, Cass took the initiative. "Thank you for your hospitality. We're honored you've included us in this ceremony." Diamant tapped his chest twice. "You are most welcome. However, I must insist on the seriousness of what you have entered, Caspian. The seating circle is sacred and shall not be disrespected. Do you understand?" Cass nodded. Then, remembering the Bulak might not understand, he tapped his chest twice as well. Diamant smiled. "I am glad to see you know how to respect potential allies." Why did he feel like everything Diamant said came with a heaping of sarcasm? He needed to get this moving. "Breach has told us of your plight, what happened to your world, to your system." "To all of us," Diamant said. "None were immune. We are a proud people. To see this happen, it's heartbreaking." "What are your current needs? How many people do you have here? And can you feed them all?" "Our needs are numerous. Surely too much for you to satisfy. But I'm willing to listen anyway." Diamant was still as a stone, but Cass could already feel his legs getting tired in the crouch. He shifted. "You're right. We can't provide enough food for everyone, but we can provide some, along with medicines and techniques for growing more. Our civilization depends on growing and making food in space. I don't know if yours—" "We're quite capable of making our own food," Diamant said. He dropped his head. "Though I admit we could use assistance in certain areas." "How much are you offering?" "First, let's talk about what we need," Cass replied. "Our ship was damaged recently. We have the ability to refine parts and components, but we need the materials. We can't just make them out of thin air." "You're in luck, Caspian. Materials we have," Diamant said. "We are a race of builders, after all." "We saw your temple under construction. Is that for—" "To honor our great ones." Diamant made a sweeping gesture with his hands. "The ones who have kept us alive during this time of trial. We all must endure hardships, but in the end, our people will thrive again." Cass glanced over his shoulder at Vreej, who had pressed himself up against the far wall. He turned back to the group. "Vreej mentioned your great ones. Were they your spiritual leaders?" "In a sense. They protected our world and our people. But when Lack was destroyed, the great ones perished with it. Those of us who remain decided a memorial in their honor was the best way to immortalize them." "But aren't your people starving?" Ryant asked. "I think what my friend means is, how can you afford to continue to build if people can't eat?" Cass added, shooting a look at Ryant. Diamant narrowed his eyes. "Trust me, we manage." His tenor changed. "I will need food and supplies for at least 5,000. Anything less,
and I'm afraid we're wasting our time."
That was out of the question. Even if he wanted to, they couldn't provide that much. Tempest's crew was barely over 100 people. He could maybe provide enough for 500 for a couple of weeks, but that would put a real strain on their own survival. He needed to switch tactics. "There was something else we're interested in," Cass said. "Breach told us you were the only person to survive the attack in your world. I'd like to hear that story." He could feel Laura tense beside him. Diamant probably had little to no idea how important his information was, and Cass didn't want to show his hand for fear of Diamant asking for even more in trade.
"I was lucky," he replied, "but it is a harrowing tale."
Out of the corner of his eye, Ryant dropped from a crouch to his knees, wincing at the pain. Cass knew exactly how he felt, though Laura seemed not to be bothered by it.
"You say you're from a faraway place."
"That's right," Cass replied.
"Then I propose a tale for a tale. Perhaps afterward we can discuss more tangible arrangements."
Panic ran through Cass's mind. Was there any downside to telling Diamant about their situation? He didn't need to mention they were looking for the Andromeda aliens. He could just say they were on an exploration. And if they got the information they required, why not? It might also loosen them up to negotiation. "Okay," Cass replied. "A tale for a tale." Diamant clapped his hands once over his head. One of the guards left the room, though no one else moved. Cass couldn't take it anymore. His legs were killing him. Diamant hadn't seemed to take any offense to Ryant resting on his knees, so Cass did the same, relishing in the brief sensation of relief in his legs. He'd be feeling that tomorrow. He watched Diamant's face for any indication it was a problem, but saw no change. The guard returned with a large bottle of green liquid, which he handed off to Diamant before returning to his post by the door.
"You should feel honored. This is one of the last bottles of Ossac from my world. It is imbibed when important information is being discussed. It peels away the distractions."
Diamant smiled, grasping the neck of the bottle and uncorking the stopper. He tipped the bottle, and a drop of the viscous liquid fell into his mouth. To Cass, it resembled tar inside, and he wasn't sure about sharing in it. There was no telling what its effects could be on a human body. Diamant offered the bottle, but Cass hesitated. Whatever was in there could be poisonous for all he knew. They had zero information on the Bulak digestive and blood systems. "Here," Ryant said, holding his hand out for the bottle. "In our culture, we drink counterclockwise." Diamant glanced at Ryant, then back at Cass, as if he suspected this might be a lie. But he handed the bottle off anyway. Cass made a subtle shake of his head for Ryant not to drink it, but the larger man ignored him, and before Cass could attempt to convince him further, he tipped the bottle back, and one drop hit his tongue. Ryant smacked his lips, running his tongue around the inside of his mouth. "It's sweeter than I expected," he said. Cass watched for any signs he might get sick or otherwise show an adverse reaction, but there were none. "I hope that comes around more than once."
"Then you're in luck. Traditionally, if the conversation lasts until the bottle is empty, it is considered a successful meeting," Diamant said, a smile on his face.
Cass eyed the bottle as Ryant passed it to Laura. She stared at it a moment with genuine interest, then smelled the opening. Without looking to Cass for confirmation, she tipped it back, and a drop fell on her tongue. A small smile appeared on her lips as she passed the bottle over. It was slightly warm in Cass's hands, and the liquid inside moved slow and with purpose as he inspected the bottle. He almost had to laugh. After all the poison he drank over the years, he was squeamish about this one unknown substance. If only Evie could see him now, hesitation and the unknown clouding his judgment. But Diamant was watching him intently, and Cass got the distinct impression if he didn't comply, there was no chance of making a deal. He tipped the bottle back. That's quite a story, Diamant said. Cass blinked, his head foggy. The Ossack either had hallucinogenic or, at the very least, alcoholic properties. Not only did he feel supremely good, but he also felt his lips loosening. Was this what Diamant had meant when he said that it stripped away all the distractions? He glanced over at Ryan and Laura, both who looked about as well as he felt. Their eyes were glazed, but not to the point where they were out of it. He could see them struggling to maintain their grasp of the situation. But they swayed, and every few minutes had to retrain their focus on the flame in the middle of the circle. The only good Cass could see was Diamant seemed to be having just as much trouble as they were. His eyes had gone glassy, and he'd straightened into an unnatural position, as if attempting to assume dominance. But his attention had remained rapt on Cass as he told him how they managed to find themselves so far away from the Coalition. He'd done his best to stay light on the finer details, attempting to craft a plausible story about a group of explorers, though he hadn't been able to keep from mentioning Susanna and a sense of loss. "I must say, I'm sorry to hear about your crew." Diamant leaned forward, his focus completely on Cass. "How are you handling it, Caspian?" He shrugged. "As well as we can. I miss her, though." "Of course you do. After all, how were you to know this creature would kill them so mercilessly?" Cass winced. Diamant had just taken a drink and passed the bottle. "But you shouldn't blame yourself." He could almost feel the tears welling up inside him, but he kept them hammered down. If Diamant saw he'd got into something precious, he'd use it for all it was worth. He was testing Cass for weaknesses. "I've lost a lot of crews in the past. You get over it," he said with a certain amount of disdain in his voice, hating himself for disrespecting her memory. "So," Diamant said, his voice lighter, as if they hadn't just been talking about one of the worst experiences of Cass's life. "Then you found yourselves in the system with the 3 suns," Diamant said. Cass nodded, taking a measured breath. The bottle was still with Ryan, who had yet to pass it on to Laura again. The blue flame danced in front of them, its energy taking on a life of its own. "We did, and found ourselves in an ambush. Here was where he needed to be careful. He wanted to move on to information about the aliens, but he couldn't tip his hand. He'd already taken this farther than he'd meant to. A ship appeared, as if from nowhere, and it controlled these mines. If not for our navigator, we never would have made it out of there alive. But we sustained damage, which is the whole reason we're here." "Out of nowhere, you say?" Diamant rolled the words around in his mouth. Laura took the bottle from Ryan, and with what seemed like a will of strength, tipped it until another drop fell on her tongue. For a second, her eyes rolled into the back of her head before she focused again and held the bottle for Cass, her arm shaking. Cass noticed it was only about half empty. Any hope of finishing it was out the airlock. They couldn't last that long. But maybe they just needed to get through Diamant's tail. He glanced behind him. The 2 guards hadn't moved, and Reeves remained beside the wall, though he'd slunk down and was clicking his finger claws together in a strange rhythm. "This ship that came from nowhere, what did it look like?" Diamant asked. Cass held the bottle, prolonging the next drink. "Black, with kind of a plow in the front, sweeping wings to the sides. I saw no windows." He wasn't about to mention he'd been aboard. That would only invite unwanted questions. Diamant nodded. "I, too, have seen this ship, and others like it. They are the ones who attacked my homeworld. We call them the Choju-Itza. It means destroyer of worlds." "What can you tell me?" Cass lifted the bottle, and another drop fell on his tongue. It was having a cumulative effect. He wasn't even sure he could stand if he wanted to. Diamant took the bottle. "My illustrious career came to an end that day. I used to be a second quile in the military. It was my life." He paused, taking a drink. "Or that's what I thought before I found this." He motioned to the room around him. "My ship was on patrol on the other side of Lac when they came. We received a general alert to unknown ships entering the system." He paused again, and Cass couldn't help but think it was for nothing more than effect. "There were so many. We had no idea. Thousands, like little bugs filling up space." He tapped at the air with his fingers. "When our scout vessels attempted to contact them, all their ships stopped, turning to face our planet. They each initiated a forced plasma beam, which entangled itself with the beams from every other ship in formation." He stopped, his eyes having glazed over, as if he were living it all over again in his mind's eye. "They gave no warning. The blast hit the northern continent, where many of our larger cities were. At first, I thought it was nothing more than orbital bombardment, and I was furious, demanding we return fire. But before our commander could give the order, we got word the planet's crust was breaking apart." He paused again, letting it sink in. "Imagine that for a moment. Watching your home, watching everything you love break apart in front of your eyes." He drew his hand into a fist, his claws cutting into his palm. "I thought the readings must be false. But there was no disguising what we saw with our own eyes. In that instant, everything changed for us. As soon as he saw what was happening, the commander ordered us behind one of Lac's 3 moons. The concussive blast of the planet breaking into millions of pieces at once destroyed or crippled most of our fleet surrounding the planet, and threw the gravitational pull of the moons out of sync. We were saved from the first shockwave, but hit with debris from the moons breaking apart. It was a miracle we survived as long as we did." He paused. "But that wasn't the end of it," Cass said. The story had a sobering effect on him. He didn't take his eyes off Diamant, only willed him to continue. Any first-hand accounts of what the aliens were capable of was perhaps more valuable than the building materials. "No. The ship was in chaos. Our commander ordered us to begin an assault on the aliens, but our propulsion was down, and we were being pulled along with what was left of the moon being thrown from orbit. Our ship was disabled, and we lost all control. People were thrown all over the ship. I lost consciousness." "You didn't see what happened next?" Diamant touched his forehead with 2 fingers, the movement slow and deliberate. "Odan, our life-giver. I can only assume they used their weapons on him. I've heard from others the fusion reaction inside Odan became so great that he expanded, then collapsed, creating a doshan, an ending to everything." "A supernova," Cass replied. "The resulting explosion caused a cascade reaction in Arla, Odan's mate. Together, their destructive power destroyed the system, all the planets, all the moons, everything. When I awoke, my entire crew was dead, and the system was decimated. My ship was in pieces, but somehow I had survived." Cass leaned forward. "Do you know how? Or why?" A smile played on his lips. "The why is easy. To lead my people into the next era of our society. How I survived? I do not know. I can only assume it was the protection of the Great Ones and their choices to bestow upon me the burden of leading our people. They knew I was the only one strong enough for it." He took another drink from the bottle and stared at the ground for a few minutes. He looked up with clarity in his eyes. "Now that we've exchanged our tales, shall we continue our negotiation?" 15. Zenfor stared at the ceiling of her quarters, barely visible in what little light filtered in from the stars through the window. She'd modify the bedding they provided her with as soon as she and Meless had boarded, but it had never felt right. The bed itself was too static. Not only was she not used to sleeping, but the idea of being fully unconscious pushed an undercurrent of fear through her. And for the first 4 days on their trip back, she hadn't slept, instead attempting to fight it off as she might a childhood disease. While Meless, however, hadn't had trouble with it. Then, over the next days, a coalition term, she'd found she could fall unconscious for short periods of time. A few squirms here and there. She became more accustomed to the accommodations and setting her body in a routine, and found she could sleep for hours at a time. When Tempest had arrived at the XL Nebula, she'd managed to work herself up to 6 hours a night, which she felt was more than enough. Any longer, and she was doing nothing more than wasting time she could be working. And she couldn't help but wonder how Meless was spending her time on Starbase 8. That was her unique property. Large problems never seemed to bother Meless, not like they did for others, especially Zenfor. But ever since those first few weeks on the ship, when she'd acclimated to normal bodily functions again, she hadn't had as much trouble sleeping as she was having now. It was as if her mind couldn't shut off to allow her to rest. In some ways, she saw this as a triumph of her iron will, that her mind was refusing to cooperate with the limits her body imposed on her. But on the other hand, it was infuriating, as she knew she had to be up at a certain time, and if she did not get her required sleep, her performance would suffer the following day. Returning to the sanctity and stability of a SIL ship couldn't come soon enough. Frustrated, she pushed herself out of bed, still fully dressed, and left her quarters. It was the middle of third shift, but a lot of crews were working overtime to try and repair all the damage from their time at Omicron Terminus. She passed 2 maintenance crews on her way from her quarters to engineering. Once she arrived, she realized this was one part of the ship that probably rarely saw downtime. Humans buzzed back and forth, so busy with their own work they didn't even notice her. The only person who seemed to realize she was there was Sester, at the far end of the room in his cradle. One of his appendages extended upwards as she entered. Zenfor averted her eyes to avoid the rest of the crew as she made her way to the back of the room. If there was one thing humans were annoyingly good at, it was asking you how you were when you made eye contact with them. She'd learned the best way to get through the days wasn't to look at anyone, ever.
"Hello, Zenfor. It's a pleasure to see you this late."
She took up her position at her console without bothering to turn it on. Even though her gaze was on the computer, all her attention was on the Klaxian in the room.
"Good evening. That's what you say, right? Morning, afternoon, evening?" "It's what many humans say. On Klaxia Prime we greet in many ways, one of which is to say, 'Your presence honors me.'" "That's very appropriate."
She'd much prefer that to, "How are you today, Consul?" or "Have a wonderful afternoon." Humans were so concerned with what could be, they forgot to focus on what was.
"You are right. They are forever chasing what is next, and longing for what has already passed. It is in their nature."
He paused.
"What can I do for you this evening?"
Zenfor took a measured breath. She'd thought about this over the past few days, but it kept it guarded. In some ways, it seemed like too much to ask, like she was invading something private. But at the same time, she felt she owed it to herself to try.
"I've enjoyed our time and discussions together. However, I want you to bring me into the mind space, like you do with our acting captain."
Sester hesitated.
"Why?" "Because I want to speak with you face to face. I want—"
She paused. It was too much. She couldn't ask this of him.
"Please, continue. I want to interact with you, physically. Being here, alone, it is difficult." "I see."
More hesitation. She shouldn't have asked. She'd reached out and was about to be slapped away. She should have just stayed in her misery. At least then she would have known it couldn't get any worse. The risk of this was excruciating.
Please focus your thoughts, Sester said. Does that mean you agree? Of course. But I have never done this with a sill before. It may take adjustments.
Trying to keep her heart from thundering out of her chest, Zenfor closed her eyes and focused her mind. She thought of her time back on Rengles, when she was in control and connected to the ship itself. They all were, in a way. The world around her fell away, and she found herself in a dark gray landscape, infinite in all directions. Above her, stars filled the night sky to every end of the horizon. She was clad in garments from her homeworld, though not the suits they wore on the ships. If she thought hard enough about it, this could be Thesleia at night. Though the air was warm, warmer than she'd ever felt it back home. Scents of Tessimon and Yeslak filled the air, the smells of home. So this was Thesleia after all, or at least her perception of it. She turned to see a figure approaching her, dressed in robes. His skin was light, but with a blue tint, though she'd never seen a sill so pale. And his eyes were devoid of any pupils, and were black instead. He stopped a few steps from her, observing the scene, taking it all in.
Is this your home?
Zenfor narrowed her eyes.
Sester?
He glanced down, examining his form.
Your people are handsome. I feel honored to represent one. Did I create this? She asked. In a way, it is the merging of our minds, and thus you see and experience what is familiar to you. Is this your home planet?
He gazed up at the sky, then to the horizon.
I think so, but not completely. Thesleia isn't this flat anywhere on the planet, to my knowledge, and it isn't this dark. One of the two suns is usually in view. On the rare occasion neither are, we call it true dark, but I've never experienced it.
She looked to the horizon, but couldn't see even the hint of twilight.
This may be what you have always wanted to see, or your own personal representation of home, a place you feel comfortable.
Zenfor turned to him and studied his features. He hadn't taken the face of anyone she knew, so some of it must be him.
Is this what you wanted? Are we still in engineering? She asked.
He nodded.
To everyone else, nothing has changed. You are at your console, and I am in the middle of repairing the microfilament centrifuge.
She sighed. Sester mentioning the engines only brought everything back. She'd wanted to get away for a few minutes. But she didn't want to be rude, not to him.
How goes your work? Slow, but I believe it should be finished within the next few hours. But that isn't why you wanted to come here.
He approached her. She stood her ground, but at the same time felt the desire to touch him bloom somewhere deep within. She reached out, not knowing if her hand would pass right through him or vice versa. But her fingers gently brushed against his shoulder, and she laid her hand there, feeling the softness of his robes and the curves of the muscles underneath.
You're real. I can...
He reciprocated the gesture, and as he held her shoulder, she shuddered, pleasure flowing through her. It had been too long. She'd been away much too long.
Sester, I must confess something to you.
The features of his face softened, a small smile tugging at his lips.
I'm here. You can tell me. I can't fix the engines. Not without rebuilding your entire undercurrent drive. The damage?
She faltered. Never before had she failed so spectacularly. And to admit her failure to anyone other than a sill was paramount to treason. But she'd been working on it all hours of the day for weeks, and each time come back to the same inevitable conclusion.
You haven't failed, Sester said, his tone gentle. As long as you breathe, you haven't failed. The amount of time it would take to repair, it could be years. And we don't have that long. Neither of our people do.
She stared into his eyes, wondering if he could see her back, if he could really see her in this place. It all felt so real, And yet she could also sense the real world beyond the edges, like she was in a protective bubble, if only for a short time. It reminded her of her biosuit, only infinitely more complex.
If that is the case, then we will have to make the journey without it. But that is not your fault. You have already helped us more than you should have.
She stilled. Could he sense the guilt in her mind, or was this something else?
Explain,
she said. He reached up and placed his hand on hers, holding his shoulder.
You have used your own technology, or at least your own knowledge, to enhance our mission. Had it not been for you, we would have died in that nebula, and our ship would have taken an extra 100 days or more to reach Omicron Terminus. Without you, we wouldn't know of Andromeda's ability to obscure themselves in time. I know it is against your culture to share information, but in our case, the information has saved our lives. We are forever in your debt.
She hadn't expected that. She'd expected him to call her weak for not upholding her principles, as a Sil would.
I have a question.
Please, he replied.
If I tell the others about the engines, what will be their reaction? What will happen?
He kept the black orbs that acted as eyes pointed directly at her.
What do you expect will happen? I expect no one will trust me for any future involvement. I will be confined back to my quarters, as we were when we first boarded. I expect I will have become nothing but an observer.
He leaned close enough that she could feel his soft breath on her skin.
We're not like that here. You will receive no punishment for not completing your task. Failure of your task does not mean failure as a person.
His words stuck with her. Despite the lack of formality surrounding it, she'd been given a specific job on this ship, which was to maintain the system she had implemented. She was the first Sil in 1,000 generations to have a task outside the one for which she was bred. Every day, as she stared at the information on the screen, telling her completion of her task in the given time frame was impossible, it chipped away at something in her. Part of her wanted to rise and say,
"See? This is why Sil only do one job their entire lives."
While another part wanted to destroy the whole system, forget it ever happened. But the last part of her, the smallest, and yet also the strongest, internalized that failure. And all she could think of was Zakria and her failure at becoming a consul. And that failure terrified her. She wasn't used to being terrified.
You don't have to be afraid here, Sister added. You are among friends.
Something inside her cracked, and she reached up, touching Sester's face.
We must bond.
He smiled, comfort radiating from him.
Show me your way. I am eager to learn.
"16. After hearing Diamant's first-hand experience with the aliens, Cass was even more on edge. Any sense of inebriation had left upon hearing the gruesome details of what had happened. And if it happened as Diamant said it had, it was something of a miracle he was there talking to the man. But he couldn't be taken in by something he only perceived. He'd known men back in the Sargan Commonwealth to embellish their tales, to increase the size of their influence, and Diamant might be no different. But he'd seen the destruction of Lac and its stars for himself via Starbase 5's long-range telescopes. Which meant he was more likely to believe the man. But coming to an agreement was a different matter. We don't have enough supplies for 5,000 of your people, Cass said, rocking back on his legs again, so he was crouched as Diamant was. Not nearly that much. But we can provide you with what we have. Surely something is better than nothing.
Caspian, you know better than that. Something worthless to me is not better than nothing. It is worse, because now I have spent time on something when I could be doing other, more important tasks.
Diamant creased his brow, turning his attention to each of them in turn. Ryant looked like he might topple over at any second, though Laura was holding her own, even if she was perspiring a lot to maintain it. Cass glanced behind him, Freeds had curled against the wall, like he was afraid of something in the room. Even though he said he and Diamant hadn't gotten along, Cass had only seen the barest dislike on Diamant's part. If it was there, it was subtle.
Unfortunately, I don't think we've done anything but waste each other's time here.
Cass winced. We can provide enough food for 250, along with medical supplies. And perhaps even some new techniques for growing food, though I'd have to clear that with my captain. Diamant touched his forehead with 2 fingers.
It isn't enough. You don't even know what we're asking for,
Laura croaked. Her voice had become hoarse. Diamant turned to her.
It doesn't matter. 250 is a pittance. You've seen my people. That will barely feed a fraction of the population.
Cass shook his head. I'm not sure we can do more. I can show you what we brought with us. It is high in nutrients and high in calories. Surely there must be some value. Diamant was silent for a moment.
Because I like you, I'm going to give you an offer lower than I would for some of our other allies who have since left us. I recognize you are in a very vulnerable position, and I want to help. 400. And if we agree, I set the terms.
Cass mulled it over. 400 was pushing it. But if they got all the supplies they needed, and Zenvor could get her advanced drive working again, they could be back in Coalition space in several days, and it wouldn't matter how many supplies they had. But there was no guarantee. And every day they hesitated was another day Tempest was under attack. I can do 400. We can leave what we have here with you now, and then bring the rest when we come back for what materials we can't carry in our shuttle.
Your material requirements? Diamant asked.
200 kilograms of galvanium, 600 of cyclax, and 14,000 beams of ursanomium. I have the molecular composition and the conversion factors. Cass pulled a small black bar from his jacket pocket, handing it over to Diamant. When Diamant pressed the button on the side, a holographic list of their items came up, complete with all the technical data.
We have these materials on hand, though we have different names for them, of course, he replied. Very well. We can make this trade.
He handed the bar back to Cass.
But there is a condition.
Cass tried not to let his concern show. Okay.
We cannot allow you to leave and return. My people are desperate. I'm not saying this is the case, but what if we gave you these materials and you never came back?
There was that teasing tone again.
I can't take that kind of risk with something so important. We wouldn't do that, Laura said forcefully. That's not what...
A look from Cass cut her off. What my colleague means is we honor our agreements.
It isn't that I don't trust you, Caspian. But how am I to know that? I propose another solution. We accompany you to your ship.
He eyed Cass carefully, perhaps looking for any sign of surprise or argument, but Cass wasn't going to give it to him.
This way, you will have all the materials you need in one trip, and we can transport our food and other goods back.
He paused again.
Without inconveniencing you.
It's no inconvenience, Cass said, though in reality it was. It would require another 2 days in transit for another round trip to the hub and back, which was that much longer they could be under attack. Diamant's proposal would be more efficient and better for them in the short term. But allowing him access to the ship was something he hadn't cleared with Evie. If he were in command, he wasn't sure how happy he'd be about his first officer bringing an unscheduled guest to the ship.
Call it compensation for not being able to provide for all our needs. We'll give you everything on your list, but I want to see this miracle ship that can travel great distances in such a short amount of time. Such a wonder something like that must be.
Inside, Cass's better judgment was screaming at him not to take this deal. He glanced at Laura and Ryant. Her face was impassioned, focused on him. She knew it was a bad deal, too. But Riot was just about out of it. He wouldn't be any help if they had to make a quick exit. By drinking that molasses, Cass had inadvertently allowed them to become compromised. If they said no now, what would happen? Would Diamant let them leave? Or would he try and capture and imprison them? Hold them for ransom for the rest of Tempest? And what other choice did he have? It wasn't like there was another source of materials close. Agreed, Cass replied. Though you understand our ship is over a day away. A smile formed on Diamant's lips. Very good. That's no problem at all. We can spare a small ship to carry the rest of your goods. And in the spirit of cooperation, I suggest one or two of your party accompany my men on our shuttle, and we'll do the same. Cass tried to keep the concern off his face. How many men do you need to bring? Only a few, half a dozen at the most. But because you're being so accommodating, I'll even sweeten this deal. We'll help you with your repairs when you arrive. You've seen what we can do. Surely we can repair your ship faster than you could. Heat rose in Cass's cheeks, and he was sure it was on full display. But he wasn't about to lose it with this man. Diamant was a seasoned manipulator, and he was such a figure of influence in Bulak society. But he couldn't let that concern him. The plight of the Bulak wasn't their main focus. He had to keep his mind straight, fix the ship, get back home. But it also opened up an opportunity that might not otherwise be present. With Diamant along, he might have the chance to learn more about the Choju Itza, as he called them. The more information they could bring back to the coalition, the better. Fine, he said, keeping his temper in check. And to prove I'm not as bad of a person as some might have made it seem, he added, his eyes on Reed, why don't you bring our mutual acquaintance back with us? He wouldn't be happy here. I know how much he enjoys his solitude on his own ship. Reed looked ready to argue, but the words died in his throat as he turned away from the circle. Cass couldn't see the harm in bringing Reed back. To be completely honest, he wasn't sure what he planned on doing with him. He half expected this to be nothing more than a farce, in which case he might have advocated to shoot Dreej out into space. But since he'd actually fulfilled his promise, he didn't see any problem with taking him back and allowing him to go on his way, provided he didn't try to steal any more parts. There's one last thing, Cass said, as they moved to get up. Diamant glanced over. We've been under attack by some renegades. They're Bulak, but Reach tells us they're of a different faction. Diamant creased his brow. Yes. After the destruction of my world, many Bulak went off on their own, instead of doing the proper thing and staying with their own people. Usually, it is a death sentence, as no other species will have anything to do with us. But it sounds like you might have run into the scavengers. They're a well-organized but small group of Bulak who prey on passing ships, wearing them down over time before sinking their teeth in. He regarded Cass for a moment. I will see what I can do for you, Caspian. After all, you have been very accommodating to us. My influence is far-reaching. They may listen. Thank you, Cass replied. Diamant retrieved the bottle of Ossack from Ryan's slack hand. He looked almost asleep, though he was still on his knees. Only half the bottle, he said. Let us hope this isn't a reflection of our agreement. He smiled. But there was something hidden behind there, something Cass didn't like. What had he just gotten them into? 17. Evie sat behind the desk in the command room, staring at the set of instructions on the screen in front of her. They were the final set of commands necessary to transfer full control of the ship over to her. She'd been staring at them for over 20 minutes, trying to gather up the courage to make the final call. Instead, she'd stared into space. She pushed the chair back and stood, clasping her hands behind her back and glaring out the window to the nothingness beyond. How was she supposed to get them out of this by herself? There was no guarantee Cass would be successful or even come back, though she really didn't need those images floating around her brain. Losing Laura and Cass in the same day would be too much. She'd resign right then and there. But then, who would take command after her? Sester? Wolf? Maybe it wouldn't matter. Maybe they were all dead anyway. Who was to say, after they repaired the ship, the Andromeda aliens weren't already out there waiting for them, just biding their time until they saw Tempest try to head for home? Maybe the best thing they could do was point the ship in a direction away from the Coalition and go. Cass might have had the right idea all along. No, she wasn't going to abandon them. Not after spending a lifetime trying to get to this point. She was now officially a starship captain, and it was her duty to protect the Coalition and its citizens from all threats, whether they be internal or external. It was her duty to sacrifice her life and the lives of those under her command for this purpose if necessary. And the one thing she could not do was give up. She tapped the comm at the side of the desk. "Wolf, report to the command room immediately." A few seconds later, the chime at her door rang. "Enter." "Yes, I'm sorry, Captain." Ever since the attack, personal hygiene had taken a back seat to more important matters, which meant her normally spiky pink hair hadn't been up for a while, and she wore it loose now. A large crop of it came down on her forehead at almost a point. But Evie thought she liked it better that way. "You're a senior bridge officer. I need a secondary input authorization before I make these changes final." Evie tapped her monitor so the same image was displayed on the other side. Wolf took a moment to read them. "The transfer codes. I'm guessing this means the captain won't be recovering," she said. "I know you and I don't always see eye to eye, but it's my responsibility to see this ship and her crew gets home and report what little we've learned. Maybe it will help, and maybe it won't make a difference, but it's our duty to try." "Hey, you don't have to tell me," she said. "Lifelong military brat here. I know the stakes." She pressed her hand to the screen. "Authorization Wolf, Delta Sigma Epsilon 425. Evie pressed her hand to her side of the screen as well. "Authorization Diazol, Tau Gamma Alpha 961. The screen flashed. "Confirmed. Command transfer complete." "I guess that's that," Evie said. "Congratulations," Wolf replied, "despite the circumstances." "For what it's worth," Evie said, as Wolf turned to leave. "I'm sorry about what happened on the shuttle. I wasn't in my right mind, and I had no right to hold you like that." Wolf shrugged. "You turned out to be right. And you got us out of that minefield. I may not always agree with all your decisions, but I don't question your motives." Evie set her face. "The next time you disagree with my decisions, I expect you to bring the matter to me, instead of speaking to others behind my back." Wolf's face went red, and she opened her mouth to reply, but instead shut it again. "Dismissed, Commander." Evie nodded. Wolf hesitated, then left her alone in the command room without another word. If there was one thing she wasn't about to stand for, it was insubordination. Transferring all the codes had been the easy step, but what came next was near impossible. Evie sighed, thinking maybe she should stop by her quarters before heading to sickbay. She could hold her grandmother's sword, look for a little comfort in what little connection she had to her family. It was too bad she couldn't carry it around the ship all the time. Maybe she'd open up the rules about personal weapons. She was in charge, after all, and they were on the frontier. She felt a lot better with it within reach at all times. Evie double-checked her uniform to make sure she'd properly affixed the captain's rank. When she'd put it on the first time, it had been a temporary measure and thus hadn't been secured well. But now the bar was straight and aligned with the rest. When they were back up to capacity, she'd make a full new uniform with all the appropriate trimmings, but for the time being, this was good enough. She just hated how it had come about. Looking around, she reflected on how solitary this moment was. Green wasn't here. Neither was Laura or Cass, or even Box. It was just her, alone with what was probably the most important promotion of her career, and she'd essentially given it to herself. She took a deep breath, straightened her uniform, and strode out the door onto the bridge.
"Report,"
she said.
"All quiet," Lieutenant Uma said. "But it's been almost 12 hours since the last attack. Are Raffinkel and her pilots ready?"
Uma nodded.
"They've taken up new positions. Ever since Vreej gave us the info, we've destroyed every fighter that's approached us. But there's no telling what else they've got out there. She's not taking any chances."
"Good," Evie said, glancing around at the rest of the bridge crew. They were all visibly tired, except for Zoll, of course. But everyone had been pulling extra shifts to cover the loss in manpower when so many of the crew had died at Omicron Terminus.
"Maybe, if we're lucky, they'll decide we're not worth the trouble anymore and go pick on an easier target." "Hope so," Uma replied. "Commander, you have the bridge. I have something to take care of in sickbay," Evie said.
The air on the bridge went still. A few people at their stations glanced at her, but most kept their eyes on their duties. She hoped someone would come out and say, "No, you can't. There still might be a chance he's going to be okay." But no one did. Evie hadn't made it public just how dire Green's condition was, but she had informed the crew he wouldn't be recovering. Now, instead of 22 funerals, they were going to need to have 23. "Yes, ma'am," Wolf said from the engineering station. She stepped forward and took the command chair, while Evie retreated to the main hypervator, her heart thundering in her chest. If Wolf was upset about their prior encounter only moments ago, she didn't show it. Evie wished Zax could have made this call without her. Even though she knew it was the right thing to do, it didn't make the actual act of telling Zax to cut the life support any easier. On the way down to the hypervator, her grief mutated into something closer to anger. This was how it should have been with her father. She should have had to make the call for him, not her captain. But he denied her that in his insanity. She hadn't looked forward to ending his life, but she'd always thought doing so would have given her a sense of closure that was otherwise missing from her life. And now she had to make the decision for someone she felt much closer to, someone she respected. Damn her father, and damn Captain Green for leaving her in this position. She wasn't ready to say goodbye to him. He'd been the perfect captain and mentor, the one who upheld everything about the Coalition, despite what he knew or suspected. He always believed humans could be better when they worked with other species, and he hadn't been wrong. This crew had done remarkably well under his guidance, and now she had to find a way to rise to his level, to become as good a captain as he was, if that was possible. Evie stepped into sickbay, swallowing the lump in her throat. It remained empty of patients, just as before. Good. Less people to watch. Box glanced up from one of the beds on the far side of the room and walked over to her. "Hello, Captain. Are you ready?" Evie nodded. "Let's get this over with. I don't want him to suffer any more than he already has." Box led her into the second compartment, and then into the surgery room, where Green was already out on one of the surgery beds. His eyes were closed, and he was attached to several devices via hoses or electrodes, all of which she assumed were keeping his bodily functions going. Zax approached from behind, her steps soft on the hard floor. "Captain," she said softly. "What do we need to do?" Evie asked. She'd never had to go through this process before. Green's normally clean face was now covered in a salt and pepper beard, though it was short. She'd have to make sure he was given a good shave before the funeral. "I need your approval on this form," Zax said, "right beside my own." She held out a small bar that, when activated, showed the authorization form to end a human life. Zax had already provided her approval. As Evie's finger hovered over the pad, she reflected at how similar this was to what she'd just gone through with Wolf in the command room. One thing begins, and another ends. She touched the pad, providing her personal authentication.
Okay, Zax whispered. Box, let's go ahead and start.
Box nodded, moving around Evie as he and Zax went to work turning off all the machines. One by one, they stopped what small noises they were making. Green's chest rose and fell, though with each breath it seemed to become shallower.
It won't take long, Zax said. You can stay here if you like. Yeah, Evie replied. No one should be alone during this.
She reached over and picked up Green's hand, placing it in her own. It was cold and rough, like he'd already been gone a while. Zax nodded and excused herself without another word.
I'll stay too, if you like, Box said. I would, thank you.
The robot positioned himself on the other side of the bed and held Green's other hand. Just to make double sure he knows, Box said. Evie smiled as tears gathered in the corners of her eyes. Silently, she said her goodbyes as Cordell Green took his final breaths and fell silent. 18. If Cass thought the journey from the shuttle to Diamant's compound was long, the way back was twice as bad. They were all still feeling the effects of the OSAC, but it seemed to have hit Ryan the worst. Laura at least had managed to stay on her own 2 feet, though she swayed the whole way back. Diamant had sent the 2 guards to accompany them back until he could arrange allocation of the materials they needed, along with one of his own ships that would be flying back with them. Cass only hoped it would give them enough time to sober up. What the hell was in that stuff? Cass asked, holding Ryan up by one side, while Vreach held him up by the other, as they helped him stumble along through the streets. The guards remained ahead of them, while Laura pulled up the rear.
OSAC is a rarity, or was, expensive, farmed in the coldest temperatures of Lac. It has a chemical which is said to remove
distractions. Yes, I heard that part, Cass snapped. Ryan was damn heavy, and he was having enough trouble keeping himself from falling, much less a 95-kilogram man.
It also has chemicals that alter the neurotransmitters in the brain. Other species seem to experience similar effects.
Fuck. The one time he'd been required to get drunk, and it had put him in a precarious negotiating position. The only thing that probably saved him was his existing tolerance. He couldn't even imagine what Laska would have said if she'd seen him back there. Although she did say to keep another species' cultural norms in mind, that it was always a good idea to assimilate yourself into their standards as best you could, to show a willingness to compromise. He wasn't sure Diamant had appreciated it as much as perhaps someone else. There was something deceptive about that man, like he was running a hidden agenda, but wanted you to know it. Or maybe that was just the OSAC talking. Whatever the reason, Cass felt like he'd done a bad job at the negotiating table. He'd given up a lot and wasn't confident it was worth the risk. "Are we close?" Cass called to the guards ahead of him. He'd lost track of their route in his attempts to keep Ryan vertical. One guard turned back, tapping his chest with his hand. Thank Cor. If he had to hold this buffalo much longer, they were all going to end up sprawled on the street, just like the people curled up in the alleyways. Cass only hoped Diamant would lead these people to a better future, but he wasn't sure that could happen. They rounded the corner to see the shuttle still sitting on one of the pads. Cass reached over with some difficulty and tapped the comm on his hand. "Hey, Saturn? You still in there?" Her face appeared in the window, and she threw up a hand. "You guys don't look so good." "Get down here and help us. Ryan is drunk." She opened the main bay doors in the back as Cass and Vreach maneuvered Ryan around the landing gear. "You okay back there?" he asked Laura. She stumbled at the sudden attention, but caught herself. "Fine." Jan came jogging around the edge of the ship and got up under Cass's side, relieving him of Ryan's weight. "What the hell did he have?" "Some Bulak concoction," Cass said. "Vreach will be happy to tell you about it later." Cass turned back to Laura. "Get back on the ship. Sleep it off." She glanced between him and the guards, who had stopped short of the ramp to the ship. "You sure?" He felt the heft of his boom cannon under his jacket. I'm sure. After the four of them had departed, Cass led the guards to the crates of supplies. Here is a sample of what we have. This is Diamant's, as a sign of goodwill. The guards tapped their chests. Thank you. We will deliver it to those who need it most. Keep your ship here until we return, and prepare a volunteer or two to accompany our ship. Got it, Cass said, his brain still foggy. That walk hadn't done him any favors. He felt like he'd been sent through a compression modulator and hadn't come out the other side. The guards unloaded the crates, and when they were done, Cass moved into the crew section of the shuttle. Ryan and Laura lay on two of the beds, stacked one on top of the other, each snoring softly. Vreej was nowhere to be found. A pulse ran through Cass's heart, and he bolted to the front compartment to find Jan and Vreej in the only two seats, engaged in conversation. She glanced up when he entered. He was just explaining to me the properties of Ossak, is it? Yes. Sounds like heavy stuff. She returned her attention to Cass. What's the play? Cass eyed Vreej for a moment. We're taking some of them back with us. They'll bring all our materials, and when we get to Tempest, we'll load our end of the agreement on their shuttle, and that will be that. Sounds simple enough. It always does. We also need a volunteer to go with them, in the spirit of cooperation. Since I'm the only one left standing who can't fly a shuttle, it seems obvious. Cass leaned up against the bulkhead, his head pounding. He wasn't sure he could handle spending a full day on an alien shuttle. He wasn't willing to trust Diamant as the one to accompany the rest of them. I will also go, Vreej offered. 2 targets. 2 targets? Cass asked. I think he means with you both there, you won't have to bear the burden alone, Jan said. Cass rubbed his head. That makes sense. Thanks. Vreej tapped his chest. Having him there would be better, because at least Cass could keep an eye on him. He trusted Vreej only marginally more than Diamant. What is it between you two anyway? Vreej lowered his head. You used to work. We're in training together. He never gave me a chance. Said I was too different. He shrugged, indicating the mechanical mandibles on his back. You're an outcast. But I thought his thing was he wanted to save all Bulak life. I would think with so few of you left, every last individual would be important, Cass replied. Diamant often says one thing means another. Vreej clicked his fingers together in a sort of rhythmical tapping. I've gathered that much at least, Cass replied. And yet you are the one who suggested him to us. We're here because of you. Because you're desperate. Because there are no other options. Cass took a deep breath. I'm going to lie down and try to get rid of this headache before we have to leave. Can you keep an eye on him? He asked. Jan nodded. I'll wake you when it's time. As Cass left, he heard Vreej ask what the motion Jan had made with her head meant. Perhaps on the trip back he could introduce the Bulak to all their mannerisms, and vice versa. That should take at least a couple of hours. But the main thing was he needed to get as much sleep as he could, because once he was on that ship, he wasn't closing his eyes for a second. Otherwise, he might never open them again. 2 hours later, Cass was still nursing the headache while boarding the Bulak ship. It was comparable in size to the Hymettus, but with less frills. It was long, with increasingly large segments toward the back, with the smallest segment at the front making of the command deck, while the cargo area was composed of one large section surrounded by 4 diagonal wings, which he assumed controlled the undercurrent. It was about 5 times as large as Vreej's ship, but made of the same materials. The colors and composition made it easy to tell they were built by the same people. It also differed from the attack ships that had been strafing Tempest, as it didn't seem to have any offensive weapons, and seemed to Cass to be bulky and difficult to maneuver. Vreej led him around back to where a large ramp had extended, allowing the Bulak to load up all their materials. Once inside, he could tell it had been more luxurious, but had been chopped up and repurposed since. He had to admit, When faced with adversity, the Bulak didn't waste any time in making whatever adjustments were necessary to survive. Had an attack like that happened on Earth or any of the Coalition worlds, he was damn sure they wouldn't be in this kind of position in less than 3 seasons. They'd still be in a disarray. But it was almost like the Bulak had been prepared to deal with this on some level. Except for the lack of food, that was. In the cargo section, hammocks had been hung from the high walls, each accessible by ladders on the sides of the cargo bay. It was possible the Bulak hollowed out any permanent crew quarters for parts, or this was just how they traveled on their ships. Around him, a dozen, not a half-dozen, as he'd been told, Bulak loaded all the materials on the shuttle without a word to him or Vreej. They all seemed tired, but didn't utter a word of complaint. Vreej directed Cass to follow him. Deeper in the ship, they passed an area full of scanning equipment that had been forced into part of the ship where it didn't belong, requiring him and Vreej to step over wires, consoles, and temporary bulkheads supporting all the haphazard devices. Cass noticed not all of them looked to be of Bulak design. He was about to ask Vreej about this when they crossed into a short corridor which could only lead to the command deck.
He'll be up there.
Vreej pointed 2 of his fingers down the hall.
Don't take your eye off him. I don't know what he's planned. Never the full picture with him.
You're not coming? Cass asked.
Better if I don't. I'll make sure all the cargo gets on board.
Cass nodded. Yeah, okay. Though he didn't like the idea of facing Diamant alone, it was better than trying to keep an eye on both of them at once. He had no idea what the cultural norms were in a situation like this, but hopefully, if he got tired of listening to Diamant prattle, he could excuse himself for one of those hammocks. Vreej nodded back, a move that surprised Cass, though when he did it, he accompanied it with 2 chest taps. With Vreej at his back, Cass continued down the rest of the corridor until he arrived on the ship's command deck. Like the rest of the ship, it had been stripped of any non-essential parts, to the point where there weren't even chairs. Instead, 2 Bulak took up positions at the front, while Diamant stood behind them, his arms folded one on top of the other. When Cass entered, he turned with a smile on his considerable lips.
Caspian, I'm so glad you decided to be the one to accompany us back to your ship. It gives us a chance to get to know each other better.
He indicated the room with a sweep of his hand.
Welcome to our ship. You see what we've been reduced to. I apologize we have nowhere for you to sit. I'm sure after the OSAC, you're tired.
I'm fine, Cass replied. I got a few winks on my own ship. Diamant cocked his head.
Winks?
Cass fumbled. Sorry. It's an idiom of ours. It means we slept lightly.
Ah,
the Bulak replied.
Well, I look forward to learning more about your culture. It sounds fascinating. With so many different species interacting all at once, it must make for some interesting get-togethers. Tell me, what is your coalition's stance on religious activities?
The question threw Cass. He hadn't expected the man to come out of the gate swinging. Well, each person is free to practice as they like. There are a few major religions within the coalition, but there are no requirements to join, stay, or refuse. It's personal preference, really.
Is it?
Diamant lowered his head, but kept his eyes on Cass.
How interesting.
He returned his attention to the Bulak in front of them.
Where are my manners? This is Jurej and Keswal. They'll be our guides back to your ship.
They turned at their names, and each tapped their chests twice. Cass nodded to them. Pleasure. How many are you bringing with you?
Oh, not too many, I think, Diamant replied. Enough to unload all the materials and help your people install them. If we work quick, we can have the job done in a day or 2.
But you don't even know the extent of our damage, Cass replied. It will take us some time to modify the raw materials into components we can use. Diamant folded his arms again.
Oh, it won't matter, he said, with a smile on his lips again. We are very good at repairs.
We find speed doesn't affect the quality of our work. That's a valuable skill, Cass said, hoping to prompt a little less posturing on Diamant's part. Yes, it is, he said. It was going to be a long ride back. 19. Evie waited in Bay 1, watching the two ships approach the open end of the bay itself. She stood near the far side, where the corridors connected to the rest of the ship, well out of the way of any approaching ships. And yet, she felt exposed out here. Her last experience on a shuttle had caused her to avoid the bays ever since. But as captain, she felt she had a duty to be here, to meet their new allies, despite being completely blindsided. What had she told him? No unnecessary risks. And what had he done? He'd brought an entire contingent of Bulak back with him, all of which could be nothing more than a boarding party in disguise. Cass had emphasized he'd found no weapons on any of them, and their ship wasn't equipped with offensive capabilities. Regardless, Evie had made sure a contingent of Raffenkel's fighters had met the ships, and she'd also had Uma assemble a security team to greet them when they disembarked. She'd been surprised to learn he'd traveled on the Bulak shuttle, and one of the Bulak had done the same on their shuttle. He hadn't said much about it, but had relayed the information in a tone that told her he'd explain later. He'd damn well better, because she wasn't about to have the ship overrun with Bulak looking for an easy poach. She'd foregone a weapon herself. The dozen armed security personnel behind her said everything she needed to. Evie almost stopped by her quarters for her sword, but decided it might be in bad taste. She had to lead this crew now, and she couldn't go off on a whim like that. Not that she could have before anyway. The Hymettus landed first, taking her regular spot. Through the windshield, Captain Jan and Laura were visible, Laura throwing Evie a brief wink as the shuttle landed. She exhaled for what felt like the first time in 3 days. Everything was okay between them. Good. She couldn't afford to be distracted right now, not when their survival depended on what happened in the next few minutes. The second ship came in and executed a perfect landing in an area designated by the flight control team on the deck. Despite their unfamiliarity with coalition procedure, they did a fair job following the team's commands. The Bulak ship didn't seem to have a port to see on the inside. Instead, it was fully opaque. Evie figured they must use remote camera sensors to see what's ahead of them. The crew of the Hymettus exited first, led by Laura, who, upon getting a good look at Evie's face, transformed her own from one of amusement to sorrow. Had she been able to tell what had happened to Captain Green from just the look on Evie's face? She needed to do a better job at hiding her emotional state. It wouldn't do for the crew to see her worried or angry. They needed her calm, collected, and sure of herself. "Captain," Laura said, approaching, placing her fist to her chest in the traditional salute. "Good trip, Lieutenant?" Evie asked. "We'll see." Behind her, Captains Ryant and Jan followed on either side of a Bulak male. He was very similar to Vrij, except his plated skin was a shade darker, and he was a bit taller. "This is Lumat," Laura added, introducing the man. "He's a Bulak engineer, responsible for many of their construction projects." "Welcome to Tempest," Evie nodded. "I am honored to be here." Lumat clasped his hands together in front of him and gave a small bow. "Captain, I need to head to sickbay," Ryan said, eyeing the door. Evie nodded. Cass had informed her of his adverse reaction to something while they were in the company of the Bulak, but he hadn't elaborated. Something else he'd have to tell her later. "I'll make sure he gets there," Jan said, leading him along. He looked somewhat green around the gills. It was never easy trying to assimilate into a foreign culture, and some people just didn't take well to it. "Captain?" She and Laura turned at the same time to see Cass approaching with one Bulak beside him and a dozen more walking behind, including Vrij bringing up the rear. Why had he brought him back? The man was a criminal, despite his help. They'd come from the cargo bay of the Bulak ship, which was now open. Inside sat crates and crates of goods. If nothing else, Cass had at least found what they needed. Now to see if it was all worth it. Evie gave her most reassuring smile while not going overboard. She couldn't read the Bulak beside Cass. only saw that he kept his eyes trained on her. "May I present Diamant of the Bulak," Cass said, indicating the man beside him.
"Captain Diazal, what an honor,"
Diamant said in an overly saccharine tone.
"I've been told you like to grasp and shake hands during an introduction."
"That's one of our customs, yes, but it isn't—"
"Then I insist you allow me to accommodate you."
Diamant reached out with one hand. Evie stared at the sharp claws on the end of each finger longer than she should have before reciprocating the gesture. She clasped her hand around his, and he did the same. Somehow, the claws didn't cut into her skin.
"Is this correct?"
Diamant asked.
"It is. Thank you. And it's a pleasure to meet you."
"Oh, no, Captain. The pleasure is all mine. It isn't often we meet other species with such a generous nature." He let go, and one of his claws caught the back of her hand. She yanked it away, inspecting the wound.
"I'm very sorry. You can see why this isn't one of our customs."
She swallowed the pain. It wasn't deep, but it was like the claw had made a very shallow but long cut that was now beating blood.
"It happens. I know it wasn't on purpose."
Diamant swung his hand behind him.
"These are my comrades, some of the best workers the Bulak Society has left. I have already spoken with Caspian, but we believe we can effect your repairs much faster if we help you refine and install all your repairs."
Evie had to work to keep the shock off her face. Cass hadn't said anything about this on his call.
"That's very generous of you, but we can manage."
"Oh, no, I insist."
"I inspected some of the damage as we approached. It will be much easier for my people to make some of the repairs. Your damage is extensive."
She didn't mention it had been more than 20 hours since the last attack on the ship. She wasn't sure if it was Diamant directing his people not to fire on them, or if they were staying away because they knew he was coming aboard. Whatever the reason, the timing was convenient.
"How about we discuss it somewhere more comfortable?"
Evie suggested, shooting looks at Cass. For his part, he held a good poker face, not betraying anything for the moment.
"While you're here, we've assigned you each quarters, where you can relax before you have to return. Enjoy our hospitality for a while."
They really didn't have the extra room, and Evie had needed to open up one of the sections they'd already closed to accommodate the Bulak. But she didn't want them to see just how bad off Tempest was at the moment. If she had to fake it until they left, then so be it. Diamant clasped one hand over the other.
"You are too kind, Captain. I look forward to sampling your accommodations. Our officers here will see that each of you reaches your individual units without delay," she added.
Diamant gave her the hint of a smile.
"Of course. Would you like us to help you unload the materials?" "No, thank you. Our people can take care of that. But we do appreciate your assistance."
She felt like she was locked into a strange dance with them, both of them circling each other in choreographed steps.
"We'll load what Caspian has promised in their place. Shouldn't take more than a few hours." "Very well. If you'd be so kind as to show us the way."
He folded his hands together like Lumat had when he'd first exited the Hymettus.
"Come with me,"
Ensign Follier said, leading the Tempest security team. Diamant and the other Bulak moved past them, following the team through the exit. Only Vreej remained.
"You too," Evie said. "I've assigned you a room as well." No more jail?" Vreej asked. "Provided you can behave. One finger out of place, and you're going right back in."
Vreej clasped his hands together and bowed, following the rest of the Bulak at a distance. Evie rubbed the back of her hand, smearing what blood had come up from the cut.
"You should get to sickbay," Laura said, taking the hand in her own. "You don't want to get an infection from something he might have had under his claw."
Evie smiled.
"I'll take care of it in a minute. Can you give me and Cass a second here?"
Laura's eyes flicked between them. She glanced around, then pushed up on the ends of her toes and placed a quick kiss on Evie's lips.
"I missed you. I'll check in with Uma and see where she can use me." "I missed you too," Evie whispered.
Laura smiled, then turned and left the two of them there, as one of the maintenance teams approached the Bulak shuttle to unload.
"You shouldn't have brought them here," she whispered to Cass without looking at him.
"I know," he replied. "It was stupid. But it seemed like the only way to get what we needed. At first it didn't seem so bad. But after spending a whole day with him, I'm not sure we can trust him. Did you notice he didn't even ask about the supplies for his people?" She nodded.
"Which means that wasn't what he was really interested in."
She cut her eyes to him.
"Green's dead."
He was still for a moment, as if he was trying to process it. I don't know what to say. He was one of the best. So then,
I'm officially the captain, and you're officially the first officer. And before you object," she said, stopping him from saying anything, "I can't do this job alone. Not right now. When we get back, if all this gets ironed out, then you can go back to being whatever it was you were before. But right now, I need to know you're 100% committed, because you just introduced a big risk to this ship, and if it goes bad—"
She stopped when she saw the conviction in his eyes.
"You're right. You shouldn't have to do this alone.
I know this was a bad call. I just hope it doesn't come back to haunt us." He shook his head, doubt seeping from him.
"Let's just get them loaded up and on their way as soon as we can."
"Wait a second," he smirked. "The only reason you gave them all quarters was so you could lock them inside."
"Precisely. And if they think they're getting access to sensitive areas of the ship—"
Cass folded his arms, his eyes on the exit where all the Bulak had left. "I already made it clear to Diamant that was out of the question."
"How did he respond?"
If she had to guess, he'd put on a good show. There was something about that man she couldn't reconcile. What was his true motive? About like you'd expect. Like he'd assumed that was the case, and almost insulted that I'd assumed they thought different. You know, playing all the angles.
"Yeah," she said, her eyes narrowing. "I know all the angles."